Have you ever stopped to think about one of the weirdest little quirks in the English language? Seriously, why do we say potatoes, but then we say pianos? It feels like it should be pianos, right? Some words ending in O get an ES for the plural, and others just get an S. It seems totally random, but believe it or not, there's actually a pattern. And today, we're going to crack the case together. So this is the big question, isn't it? This is the heart of the whole mystery. You've got one potato, two potatoes, but one piano, two pianos. What is the deal? This is probably one of those things you just know without ever really knowing why. But the logic behind it is actually pretty cool. And this right here just lays the confusion out for everyone to see. In one corner, you have the ES words, tomatoes, heroes, echoes. In the other corner, the words that just take a simple S, photos, solos, kilos. They all end with the letter O, so what gives? Okay, to figure this all out, let's treat it like we're grammar detectives on a case. We're going to look for clues, we're going to spot the patterns, and we are going to crack the code of these O plurals. So go ahead and grab your imaginary magnifying glass. Our investigation starts right now. So our first major clue is what I'm calling the hero rule. This is the one that covers a lot of those classic ES words that probably first pop into your head. It's really the oldest pattern of the bunch, and it applies to some of the most common words we use. The key here, the really crucial detail, is the letter that comes right before that final O. If it's a consonant, like the T in potato or the R in hero, the general rule of thumb for these older foundational words is to add ES. And here are our prime suspects, the words that follow this rule to a T. Potato, tomato, hero, echo. You can see it plain as day. There's a consonant right before the O, so bam, we add ES to make it plural. This is the first big piece of our puzzle. All right, let's move on to our next clue. This one covers a much bigger, more, modern group of words. We'll call this one the modern rule. And it's going to explain why so many other words that end in O break away from that first pattern we just looked at. Now, what's really fascinating here is that this is kind of like a 2-for-1 rule. First part, if the letter before the O is a vowel, A, E, I, O, U, you just add an S. Easy enough. The second part, and this is huge, is that most newer words that were borrowed into English, especially the techie or musical ones, they also just take an S. And here we go. You can see it in action. A photo is just short for photograph. A kilo is a measurement. These are fairly modern words in the grand scheme of things. And then look at radio and zoo. They've got a vowel sitting right before that O, so they fit the pattern perfectly. You just tack on an S. This rule is super consistent when you look at musical terms, a lot of which come to us from Italian: piano, solo, soprano, concerto. All of them are, relatively speaking, newer loanwords, and they all very neatly follow that modern pattern of just adding an S. No fuss. Okay, every good detective story has a twist, and this case is no different. Now we've arrived at the hybrids. These are the words that just can't seem to pick a side. We're going to call this our volcano rule, and we named it after one of its most famous members. Yep, you heard that right. For a small, specific group of words, both endings are actually considered correct. It's just a great example of how flexible English can be. Over time, the way we use words can kind of blur the lines. These are the words that are basically caught in a tug-of-war between the old rule and the new one. This table shows our main group of hybrids perfectly. For words like volcano, buffalo, mosquito, and tornado, you can technically spell the plural with an S or an ES, but, and this is interesting, notice how the ES version is still listed as more common? It shows they're still kind of leaning back toward that older hero rule, even if they're starting to change. All right, we've gathered all the evidence, we've identified the main patterns, we've looked at the exceptions. I think it's time we put it all together and officially declare this case closed. And here it is, the whole solution laid out on one slide. You've got the hero rule for older words that have a consonant before the O. Then there's the modern rule for words with a vowel before the O, or for most newer words. And finally, the volcano rule for those few oddball hybrids where you can kind of choose your own adventure. So I guess the big takeaway here is that, no, English doesn't have one single perfect ironclad rule for this. But what it does have are these very strong, predictable patterns. It's really a story about how language grows and changes. The older words stick to the older rules, and the newer words create new ones. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
This whole O plural puzzle is just one tiny example of how delightfully complex and messy the English language is. It really makes you wonder, right? What other rules that we learn are really just a collection of historical habits and a whole bunch of exceptions? Definitely something to think about.